Hello and welcome to Frank Philosophy, where we try to speak frankly about philosophy. I'm your host, Frank, a philosopher. I have a BA, an MPhil, and a PhD in philosophy, and I teach philosophy at a university far, far away. And today we'll be looking at one of the most important philosophical texts in the Western philosophical canon, the Meditations on First Philosophy by René Descartes. Now, you may have heard of the Meditations before, or you might not have, but rest assured it is very, very important. You may even have been assigned the Meditations for your Intro to Philosophy course, in which case you are in the right place, because throughout this video, this series of videos, I should say, we will go through the Meditations line by line, step by step, giving comments and explanations along the way. So if you're ready to dive into one of the arguably most important bits of writing, I would say, in the entire Western canon, well, you're in the right place. Okay, so Meditations is by a guy named René Descartes. I've already done a video on Descartes, namely his Discourse on Method, or the Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting the Reason in Pursuit of the Sciences, or something like that. And that was written a couple years before the Meditations was written. And that was also written in French. And in that work, it's a little more biographical, autobiographical, I should say, and he talks a little bit more about his life and his goal of, where this pursuit of knowledge fits in his broader pursuit of science and scientific truths and the development of science. He talks a little bit about medicine in there. He talks about astronomy. He talks about geometry and other areas of knowledge, not just philosophy. So that's more of like a critical thinking manual. And if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend my Descartes Discourse on Method video, and we go through it in the same sort of way that we'll go through the Meditations here. But the Meditations, on the other hand, was written in Latin first, and it's more of a hardcore, pure work of philosophy. And that's usually why it's more commonly assigned in an intro course, even though it's arguably, a little more boringer. I think the Discourse on Method is a little more fun, and this is more just argument in a very classic philosophical style. But it is a very clear argument, and it's classic argument. A lot of these arguments, aside from the fact that he didn't invent all of them 100% organically or originally, they have certainly stuck around in terms of their influence that they've exerted over the history of philosophy to follow. So there's lots of important and good stuff here, and I'll do my best to present it in a way that's engaging and very close to the text. So we'll be reading through it line by line, as I said. Okay, but if you want to learn more about Descartes, again, I'd highly recommend that video. I'm not going to go into his biography, other than just saying that he was a really smart guy, and he was certainly a badass. He was a a mercenary at one point. He just fought in a war, I think just for fun. I'm pretty sure just for fun, or just because. He loved to travel when he was young, and I think one of the ways to travel was to go fight in a war. So I think he just traveled to, or just went to go fight in a war for fun, among other things. And he was also totally a nerd. So that's why we love him. He's a very lovable figure, although he's also a very hateable figure. A lot of people love to hate Descartes, but I think he's all right. Okay, so this work comes from, it was written in Latin originally, and this translation is I'm pretty sure, public domain English translation by Elizabeth Haldane. It is more bearable, I think, than the Discourse on Method translation by John Veitch that I used for the other video. So hopefully the English here is a bit smoother. I think it is. Her English is fairly modern. Maybe there could be a more modern translation out there somewhere. I think the Donald Kress version from the Hackett. But that one I'm halfway worried about copyright, so we'll just go with the public domain translation by Liz Haldane over here. And then I prepared the document in terms of the formatting and stuff. There's a couple different versions of this floating around online, but I wanted to do my own just with the public domain translation, just for, safety's sake. Okay, so this is going to be a 7-part series. there are 6 meditations and then some prefatory material, and we will go through the prefatory material in this video first. So this is just the intro to the meditations, which will include, well, the preface, which, I mean, this doesn't really count. This is by the translator. We'll do the dedication, because he dedicated the work to, to this group, to the dean and doctors of the Sacred Faculty of Theology in Paris, because he wanted it published in Paris, because he was worried that if he published it in in Holland, where he was living, then he might have gotten in trouble for it, because this is a borderline heretical work. This work almost got him in trouble. Actually, I think it did get him in trouble. And this was like during the time when Galileo was getting himself in trouble. And Descartes, in this work, he presents himself as, I'm arguing for the existence of God, but some people took it as a bit of blasphemy, I guess. And some people who wear fancy robes and have clerical authority decided that. So he got himself in a little bit of trouble, and he was definitely more worried about the situation in Holland than in France. So he sent it to the French and wrote this dedication to them to convince them, please publish this and don't, arrest me. Then he's got a preface to the reader, and then he's got a synopsis of the 6 meditations. So we're just going to get through this today. And in the next video, we'll go through meditation 1, and then we'll do 1 video for each meditation. And that's how it's going to be. It's going to be all in a playlist. It's going to be a nice little series. If you get assigned the meditations, or if you're interested in them, or if you, just want to learn more about the meditations, you'll have all these videos to go through and consult at your leisure. Okay. I think that's it for intro stuff. And yeah, let's just get into it. Meditations on First Philosophy. Okay, here's the preface by the translator. Prefatory note. The first edition of the Meditations was published in Latin by Michael Soli of Paris at the Sign of the Phoenix in 1641, cum privilegio approbatione doctorum. I don't know what any of that stuff is, but the royal privilege was indeed given, but the approbation seems to have been of the most indefinite kind. Okay, so this is, by the way, this is Liz Haldane writing. This is just the translator's introduction. So she's saying that it was first published in 1641 in Latin, in Paris. Right. The reason of the book being published in France and not in Holland, where Descartes was living in a charming country house at Endergeest near Leiden, was apparently his fear that the Dutch ministers might in some way lay hold of it. His friend Pierre Mersenne took charge of its publication in Paris and wrote to him about any difficulties that occurred in the course of its progress through the press. The second edition, however, was published at Amsterdam in 1642 by Louis Elsevier, and this edition was accompanied by the now completed objections and replies. Okay, so he published it first in Paris in Latin, and then it was published a second time with objections and replies. We don't have those. I'm not going through those. We're just going through the original. Although I think let's look. The edition from which the present translation is made is the second just mentioned, and is adopted by M.M. Adam and Tannery as the more correct, for reasons that they state in detail in the preface to their edition. Okay, so we're not reading that. But we're basing this translation on the second edition, which was tidied up, or which was produced after the objections and replies were made, right? So he published it once, he got a bunch of feedback, and then he published objections and replies, and then sort of revised the original. Not to, he doesn't deal with objections and replies in there, but he does add in some clarifications, and there's slight modifications to make the objections and replies less, inviting, or at least to make the objections less inviting. The work was then translated into French by Duc de Luynes, Duc de Luynes, I don't know, in 1642, and Descartes considered the translation so excellent that he had it published some years later. Right? So eventually this was published in French, and again, that was a big deal. The Discourse on Method was written in French, but real philosophy was written in Latin still. And that was the case, but Descartes wanted it in French too, eventually, and he thought the translation into French was so good that he had that published too. Claire Cellier, to complete matters, had the objections also published in French with the replies, and this, like the other, was subject to Descartes' revision and correction. This revision renders the French edition specially valuable. All right, so after the objections and replies were published in French, or were about to be published in French, Descartes went back over again and sort of modified the French version to clarify things and make it less prone to objection as well. So as a result, where it seems desirable, the alternative reading from the French is given in square brackets, right? So there might be some places where the Latin was a little bit unclear, but then in the French edition, Descartes added in some clarification in French, and Haldane has added that in where it seems necessary, I guess, or maybe where there's some significant deviation. So this is the second edition, which would have been published along with the objections and replies, but we're not reading those. We're just reading the sort of revised or second edition of the original Latin translation with some help from the French. Okay. That's boring translation-y stuff. Cool. Okay. So that's the translator preface. Now we're to the dedication. Now the dedication, again, this was sort of Descartes' way of basically his cover letter for the book when he sent it to the people who were going to approve and publish it, right? The Sacred Faculty of Theology in Paris, right? I guess they were the ones who were going to print it or approve of it or whatever needed to be done to make sure that it actually got out. And he, wrote this cover letter saying, why should you publish this? Basically, it's his sales pitch. This is basically Descartes' sales pitch for this work to be published. And please don't kill me because I'm very pious and I love God, and God definitely exists, and I'm totally Catholic. Don't kill me, please. So that's kind of the vibe we get here. So let's go through it. And this will also introduce you to his writing style and the style of the translation. So even though this isn't quite exactly the philosophy, it's still kind of interesting from an autobiographical or historical perspective. Okay. The motive which induces me to present to you this treatise is so excellent, and when you become acquainted with its design, I am convinced that you will also have so excellent a motive for taking it under your protection that I feel that I cannot do better, in order to render it in some sort acceptable to you, than in a few words to state what I have set myself to do. Okay, so that's a long sentence. But basically he's saying this is... this work, this thing, this treatise, this book is so fire. It's so amazing. It's so awesome that, I just feel like I have to just tell you a little bit about it to help you, convince you that, you should publish it, and definitely not arrest me or anything like that. You should definitely publish it. Take it under your protection, meaning get on board and say, actually, this is fine. This is not heretical. This is good, acceptable, totally kosher Catholic writing. It's fine. So I'm going to, in a few words, state what I have set myself to do. So what's the goal, basically? What am I trying to do in the meditations? That's what he's explaining right here. I've always considered that the two questions respecting God and the soul were the chief of those that ought to be demonstrated by philosophical rather than theological argument. Okay, so these are the first two and the main two questions that motivate the meditations. And again, he talks about this a little bit in the discourse. He very quickly makes the arguments that he ends up making in full here. But these are the main questions that he gives the full treatment to in the meditations, right? The existence of God and the immortality of the soul, right? And these were chief of those that ought to be demonstrated by philosophical rather than theological argument, right? So there's this distinction between philosophy and theology, right? Where theology, basically, it's a one way to put it is it's a branch of knowledge that allows you to make the assumption that allows you to make certain religious assumptions based on faith rather than on pure reason alone, right? So, when you're doing theology, you can assume that God exists, right? Or you can assume that Jesus rose from the dead, or whatever, right? But when you're doing philosophy, you can't make those assumptions. You need to base everything on the progression of reason through an argument, right? And he thinks that these two questions, right, God and the soul, ought to be demonstrated with philosophy rather than just assumed or utilized in theological argument. For although it is quite enough for us faithful ones to accept by means of faith the fact that the human soul does not perish with the body, and that God exists, it certainly does not seem possible ever to persuade the infidels of any religion, indeed we may almost say of any moral virtue, unless, to begin with, we prove these two facts by means of natural reason. So, this is almost like a colonial argument where he's saying that, look, I need to do this. I need to prove the existence of God and the immortality of the soul because, we have to be able to convince the infidels of these two things because it's very important. And if we don't have a way of convincing non-believers that these two things should be accepted, right, that God exists and the soul is immortal, then we'll never be able to go out and convert people and colonize successfully, right? Because Descartes was a Jesuit trained, right? He was a Catholic, and the Jesuits and the Catholics were, the missionaries in Europe, or like the main missionary groups in Europe that went to places like China and the New World and things like that. So part of the motivation is like, look, we're going to be so much more effective at persuading the infidels and getting more converts if I can make this argument. And that's a really strong argument. I mean, that would have been pretty compelling to religious authorities back in the day. So good move, Descartes, starting with the strongest argument, right? Good. And inasmuch as often in this life greater rewards are offered for vice than for virtue, few people would prefer the right to the useful, where they restrained neither by the fear of God nor the expectation of another life. And although it is absolutely true that we must believe that there is a God because we are so taught in the Holy Scripture, and on the other hand that we must believe the Holy Scriptures because they come from God, the reason of this, that faith being a gift from God, he who gives us the grace to cause us to believe other things can likewise give it to cause us to believe that he exists, we nevertheless could not place this argument before infidels, who might accuse us of reasoning in a circle. Okay, so this is fun, because, I don't know, if you're of the atheist persuasion, right, you may have heard of this argument, or you may have come across the argument that religious beliefs are circular in a way, that, we should believe in God because it says so in the Bible, and on the other hand, we should believe the Bible because the Bible comes from God. And this is like one of the many arguments that you might see online, that you might have seen online, 15 years ago on Reddit or something, that, for why not to believe in God. One of the reasons for atheism is that the belief, or one main argument for the existence of God, namely that it comes from the Bible, or that the Bible says so, is a circular argument, right? So Descartes is like starting with this, right? He's saying, if you were to tell that to people who don't already believe, then they would just accuse you of giving a circular argument. So Descartes is making this edgy atheist argument like 400 years ago, right? Or at least he's saying that people reason this way, that edgy atheists think this way. They think it's circular to blame or to claim that we should believe in God because the Bible says so, and we should believe the Bible because God wrote it, or whatever, right? So he's like getting this meme of an argument out of the way, and saying, look, we have to give a better argument to people who don't believe, right? So the audience for the meditations is really the non-believers, right? It's really the edgy atheists, right? So if you're an edgy atheist, you are Descartes' target here, right? You are the people that he wants to convince. And he thinks that he can do it. He thinks he's got it figured out, and he does so sincerely, right? So I just find that interesting that, you see this meme of an argument that, religious beliefs are circular because it, relies on the Bible must be true, but the Bible is true because it was written by God. Things like that, right? That circle. And Descartes says, yeah, like that kind of problem, we're going to need to do better if we want to convert people. And in truth, I have noticed that you, namely the deans, right? You, along with all the theologians, did not only affirm that the existence of God may be proven by natural reason, but also that it may be inferred from the Holy Scriptures, that knowledge of Him is much clearer than that which the Scriptures have of many created things, and, as a matter of fact, is so easy to acquire that those who have it not are culpable in their ignorance. Right, so the idea that we can prove the existence of God by natural reason, and that, yes, if we read the Bible, the Holy Scriptures, it does make it clear that we should believe in God, right? And that, in fact, our knowledge and our belief in God should be stronger than our belief in many other things, right? It should be not just any belief, it should be a foundational one. It should be easily ascertained by reading, the Bible, the Holy Scriptures, right? This indeed appears from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 13, where it is said, Howbeit they are not to be excused, for if their understanding was so great that they could discern the world and the creatures, why did they not rather find out the Lord thereof? Right, so now he's quoting the Bible and saying, look, there's this line in the Bible. Oh, that's what he's saying. There's this line in the Bible that, it says in the Bible that we should be able to, just by using our minds, figure out that God exists. So I shouldn't be in any trouble for trying to argue that God exists because, look, it says in the Bible, you should be able to just use your mind. The light of natural reason may be proven by natural reason, right? So natural reason is, using our brains, right? Using reason and logic to infer that God exists, right? Because he's worried that, like, if he says that we need to prove the existence of God rationally, then that might be seen as heretical because you're not supposed to prove that. You're supposed to believe that as a matter of faith, right? Or you don't need to prove it. Or like if you try to prove the existence of God and then fail, that's a real risk, right? Then you accidentally gave an argument against the existence of God, right? So there's a worry there. But Descartes is saying that, look, in the Bible itself, it says we should be able to figure this out and prove the existence of God or perceive the existence of God through the use of our natural reason anyway, right? So he quotes this line from Solomon. And then in Romans chapter 1, it is said that they are without excuse, right? So people who don't believe in God, they have no excuse. It should be totally apparent to anybody who's able to use their brain that God exists, right? And again, in the same place, by these words, that which may be known of God is manifest in them. It seems as though we were shown that all that which can be known of God may be made manifest by means which are not derived from anywhere but ourselves, and from the simple consideration of the nature of our minds, right? So it says in the Bible that if we think clearly enough about stuff, we should be able to conclude that God exists, right? Even in the Bible, it says that we should be able to do that. So what I'm doing is in line with what it says in the Bible. So definitely don't arrest me. Right? Hence I thought it not be beside my purpose to inquire how this is so, and how God may be more easily and certainly known than the things of the world. Right? So he said, well, it says that in the Bible, and all I'm doing is trying to figure out how exactly that works. How does it work that our brains can clearly, or our minds can more clearly perceive God than anything else, right? And that's what it says in the Bible. How does that work? So all I'm doing is going with what's in the Bible, right? Okay, so there's like a couple arguments in there for why it's okay for him to argue for the existence of God. And as regards the soul, although many have considered that it is not easy to know its nature, and some have even dared to say that human reasons have convinced us that it would perish with the body, and that faith alone could believe the contrary, nevertheless, inasmuch as the Lateran Council held under Leo X in the 8th session condemns these tenets, and as Leo expressly ordained Christian philosophers to refute their arguments and to employ all their powers in making known the truth, I have ventured in this treatise to undertake the same task. Right? So the soul stuff is like a little less controversial, I guess, right? Because it's arguing for the existence of God is a little dicier than arguing for the existence of the soul. It's just a slightly less controversial topic, and so it gets a shorter paragraph here, right? And he's saying, well, look, there have been lots of philosophers who have argued that the soul actually does die with the body, and it perishes, and the soul is not immortal. But the Pope, after this council, says that no, the soul is immortal, and in fact, all the Christian philosophers should go and use their reason to the best of their ability to argue in favor of the immortality of the soul, right? We need to get the philosophers on the case to make sure that it is known that the soul is in fact immortal. So Descartes just doing what the Pope told him. So definitely don't arrest him. More than that, I am aware that the principal reason which causes many impious persons not to desire to believe that there is a God, and that the human soul is distinct from the body, is that they declare that hitherto no one has been able to demonstrate these two facts. And although I am not of their opinions, but on the contrary hold that the greater part of the reasons which have been brought forward concerning these two questions by so many great men are, when they are rightly understood, equal to so many demonstrations, and that it is almost impossible to invent new ones, it is yet my opinion, the case that nothing more useful can be accomplished in philosophy than once and for all to seek with care for the best of these reasons, and to set them forth in so clear and exact a manner that it will henceforth be evident to anybody that they are veritable demonstrations. Right? So he's also saying that, look, I'm not the first one to argue for the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, but I'm hoping to do so in a way that's like clear and compelling and short and concise and in one place and basically dummy proof, right? Basically, anyone who reads this should come away thinking like, yep, the soul is definitely immortal and God definitely exists, and everything else that follows from it is super cool too, right? So he's saying that, even though he's not the first one to come up with this stuff, I want to set them forth in so clear and exact a manner that it will be evident to everybody that they are veritable demonstrations. And finally, inasmuch as it were desired that I should undertake this task by many who were aware that I had cultivated a certain method for the resolution of difficulties of every kind in the science, I have thought that it was my duty also to make trial of it in the present matter. Right? I skipped this parenthetical. I'll read it again with the parenthetical, but I just wanted to give the full sentence without the interruption. But he's talking about what he's done already in the discourse on method, right? He's saying, inasmuch as it were desired that I should undertake this task by many who were aware that I had cultivated a certain method for the resolution of difficulties of every kind in the science, right? So what happened in the discourse on method, right? That methodology, people know that, a method which it is true is not novel, since there is nothing more ancient than the truth, but of which they were aware that I had made use successfully enough in other matters of difficulty, I have thought that it was my duty also to make trial of it in the present matter. Right, so he's got this method and he wants to use it here for this stuff. He wants to use it to prove the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. Right, he wants to give like a demonstration, right, to make a trial of it. Right, so I have this method. Let me use it for this stuff. Let me use it here. Now, all that I could accomplish in the matter is contained in this treatise. Right? Everything I've accomplished is here. It's all here. Not that I have here drawn together all the different reasons which might be brought forward to serve as proofs of this subject, for that never seemed to be necessary, excepting when there was no one single proof that was certain. But I have treated the first and principal ones in such a manner that I can venture to bring them forward as very evident and very certain demonstrations. Right? So it's not everything. He's not giving all the reasons. He's just giving the most excellent, clear, and strongest reasons that he can. And more than that, I will say that these proofs are such that I do not think that there is any way to open the human mind by which it can ever succeed in discovering better. Right? So these are the best. These are the best proofs that you could possibly have. The best arguments for the existence of God and for the immortality of the soul are these. There might be other ones, but these are just the best, the clearest, and the most important. For the importance of the subject and the glory of God to which all this relates constrain me to speak here somewhat more freely of myself than is my habit. Nevertheless, whatever certainty and evidence I find in my reasons, I cannot persuade myself that all the world is capable of understanding them. Still, just as in geometry, there are many demonstrations that have been left to us by Archimedes, by Apollonius, by Pappus, and others, which are accepted by everyone as perfectly certain and evident, because they clearly contain nothing which, considered by itself, is not very easy to understand, and all through that which follows has an exact connection with and as all through that which follows has an exact connection with and dependence on that which precedes, nevertheless, because they are somewhat lengthy and demand a mind wholly devoted to their consideration, they are only taken in and understood by a very limited number of persons. So he's saying, basically, even though I'm giving you the best of the best of the best reasons, probably not everybody is going to get it. Just like in geometry, even though we have these amazing, solid, absolutely true proofs given to us by people like Archimedes and Apollonius and other geometers, right? People still look at that stuff and have no idea what's going on, right? Even though it's totally clear and totally true. So he thinks that there's going to be a learning curve, and not everybody's going to get it, even though, it's as clear and obvious to an intelligent person as possible, right? So he's basically saying, he's covering his ass for when people read this and say, I don't get it, right? Because people are going to read this and say, oh, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. He's saying, no, it doesn't not make sense. You just don't get it. In the same way that you just don't understand the proof for the Pythagorean theorem or something, right? So there's going to be limitations on how widely the Meditations is accepted owing to the proliferation of stupidity and the rarity of a type of mind that's careful and intelligent and committed enough to learning this stuff that they can really understand it, right? So don't send this to any dumb priests to look at, basically, right? Similarly, although I judge that those of which I here make use are equal to or even surpass in certainty and evidence the demonstrations of geometry, I yet apprehend that they cannot be adequately understood by many, both because they are also a little lengthy and dependent, the one on the other, and principally because they demand a mind wholly free of prejudices, and one which can easily be detached from the affairs of the senses. So he's basically saying that you kind of have to be in the right mindset to understand his meditations here. You need to, like, because these are long meditations. This is a long writing. The arguments are complex. They're a little tricky to keep track of. This is hard philosophy. This is not easy stuff, and you kind of really have to suspend your judgment and get yourself into the mindset that Descartes wants you to be in. So he's making it clear just how big of an ask this is to the audience and the readership. And he's saying that, like, probably people are going to read this and not get it. So he's anticipating the kind of problems that he's going to have in terms of the objections. And, truth to say, there are not so many in the world who are fitted for metaphysical speculations as there are for those of geometry. So again, he's big on this analogy between philosophy and geometry, because he's a rationalist after all, right? And his idea is that the best kind of knowledge we can have is stuff that looks like math and geometry. Like, that level of certainty is what we want everywhere, basically. And he's saying he's got that here. I have proofs, I have demonstrations, I have arguments here that are as certain and clear as geometry. I have that. But because of the subject matter itself, there might be some issues persuading people or teaching them this stuff and getting them on board, right? Because geometry is just, there are fewer people in the world whose minds are fitted for metaphysics than for geometry, right? So there are more geometry-minded people than metaphysics-minded people, and that might be true. I don't know. It sounds like an empirical generalization. I'd like to see a study, I guess. And more than that, there is still this difference, that in geometry, since each one is persuaded that nothing must be advanced of which there is not a certain demonstration, those who are not entirely adepts more frequently err in approving what is false, in order to give the impression that they understand it, than in refuting the true. Right. I'm not quite sure I get that. But anyway, maybe you get it. Tell me what it means in the comments. But the case is different in philosophy, where everyone believes that all is problematical, and few give themselves to the search after truth, and the greater number, in their desire to acquire reputation for boldness of thought, arrogantly combat the most important of truths. Oh, so I guess he's talking about, like, the work that people do in philosophy is different from the work that people do in geometry, right? Because in geometry, it's less common to, like, argue against a position, I guess. Whereas in philosophy, proving somebody's argument is wrong or showing that some really important idea is wrong is much more common, right? To arrogantly combat the most important truths. Okay, that is why whatever force there may be in my reasonings, seeing they belong to philosophy, I cannot hope that they will have much effect on the minds of men, unless you extend to them your protection. All right, so he's saying this is going to be hard stuff. It's going to get me in trouble. People aren't going to get it. They're going to get upset. They're going to think that it's wrong, and that's why I need your approval, Mr. Cleric, priest, dean of theology guy. I need your approval so people know to take this stuff seriously and not just, form an impression based on how they feel. But the estimation in which your company is universally held is so great, and the name of Sorbonne carries with it so much authority, that next to the sacred councils, never has such difference been paid to the judgment of any body, not only in what concerns the faith, but also in what regards human philosophy as well. Everyone indeed believes that it is not possible to discover elsewhere more perspicacity and solidity. Perspicacity, I'm going with that. And solidity, or more integrity and wisdom in pronouncing judgment. For this reason, I have no doubt that if you deign to take the trouble in the first place of correcting this work, for being conscious not only of my infirmity but also of my ignorance, I should not dare to state that it was free from errors, and then, after adding to it these things that are lacking to it, completing those which are imperfect, and yourselves taking the trouble to give a more ample explanation of those things which have need of it, or at least making me aware of the defects so that I may apply myself to remedy them. When this is done, and when finally the reasons by which I prove there is a God, and that the human soul differs from the body, shall be carried to that point of perspicuity to which I am sure they can be carried in order that they may be esteemed as perfectly exact demonstrations, if you deign to authorize your approbation and to render it public testimony to their truth and certainty, I do not doubt, I say, that henceforward all the errors and false opinions which have ever existed regarding these two questions will soon be effaced from the minds of men. So, once... Jesus, I think that's one sentence. That's insane. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 15. Many lines. That's way too many lines. Don't write sentences this long. God. Okay. Yeah, so he's saying that, like, I'm giving this to you. Once you look at it, approve it, tell me what needs to be fixed, edit it, right? Once we go through this publication process together and it gets out there, it gets published, then all the errors and false opinions which have ever existed regarding these two questions will soon be effaced from the minds of men. Everybody's gonna be enlightened once this gets published in its perfect form, right? Once these arguments are perfected, everyone's gonna be on board with the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. For the truth itself will easily cause all men of mind and learning to subscribe to your judgment, and your authority will cause the atheists, who are usually more arrogant than learned or judicious, to rid themselves of their spirit of contradiction, or lead them possibly themselves to defend the reasonings which they find being received as demonstrations by all persons of consideration, lest they appear not to understand them. So even the atheists are going to get on board with this once the perfected version of this writing is published, right? And finally, all others will easily yield to such a mass of evidence, and there will be none who dares to doubt the existence of God and the real and true distinction between the human soul and the body. It is for you now, in your singular wisdom, to judge of the importance of the establishment of such beliefs, you who see the disorders produced by the doubt of them. But it would not become me? I guess it would not be becoming of me to say more in consideration of the cause of God and religion to those who have always been the most worthy supporters of the Catholic Church. Okay. So that's the dedication, right? So that's his sales pitch, basically, to the people that he wants to, like, publish and approve of it and make sure that he doesn't get himself thrown in jail for publishing this thing about the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, which are really important church doctrines, right? So he wants to make sure he's got the church on his side before he publishes this. He was only moderately successful. He got himself in trouble, as I said, but this was his effort. This was his sales pitch. And again, it's pretty good, right? He's saying that, look, we need to deal with edgy atheists and infidels. And that's really important. And that's why we need to give these reasoned arguments, not just, based on faith, for the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. That's why I need to do this. Okay. So that's the dedication. Now, the preface to the reader. Now, I'm not sure. That was a noise. Sorry about that. I gotta go back and check. I think because this is the second edition, I think the preface is from the second edition. I'm pretty sure. So yeah, because he talks about objections in the preface, So this might be from the edition after the objections were already received. So we'll see. But anyway, here's the preface. Preface to the reader. I have already slightly touched on these two questions of God and the human soul in the discourse on the method of rightly conducting the reason and seeking truth in the sciences. Right, so that's the one we already did. Published in French in the year of 1637. Right, so this is 4 years later, 1641. Not that I had the design of treating these with any thoroughness, but only, so to speak, in passing, and in order to ascertain by the judgment of the readers how I should treat them later on. For these questions have always appeared to me to be of such importance that I judged it suitable to speak of them more than once, and the road which I follow in the explanation of them is so little trodden and so far removed from the ordinary path that I did not judge it to be expedient to set it forth at length in French and in a discourse which might be read by anyone or by everyone, in case the feebler minds should believe that it was permitted to them to attempt to follow the same path. So that's interesting, right? So he didn't want to get into the God and the soul stuff in the Discourse on Method because he wrote it in French. And I guess he didn't want a bunch of backwards, uptight French clergymen reading his argument for the existence of God kind of in like a critical thinking textbook and taking it really seriously and getting himself in trouble for it, right? So he just sort of mentioned those things in passing. But now he gives it the full treatment in Latin, the way it should be done in the context of real philosophy, right? But having in this discourse on method begged all those who have found in my writings somewhat deserving of censure to do me the favor of acquainting me with the grounds of it, nothing worthy of remark has been objected to in them beyond two matters. To these two I wish here to reply in a few words before undertaking their more detailed discussion. Oh, okay. Right, so the preface isn't in response to the objections from the first edition of the Meditations. The preface is in response to objections that were raised anyway in response to the Discourse on Method, where he talks about this stuff, right? Because he gives the short version of the argument for the existence of God and the argument for the immortality of the soul in the Discourse on Method. But, people read that and said, hey, here, that doesn't work, or here's my objection or whatever. And Descartes says, well, I got a lot of objections anyway, even though I, sort of just dealt with them in passing. But there were two objections that I do want to just like mention at the outset to say, I'm going to deal with that stuff in detail in the Meditations. Okay. The first objection is that it does not follow from the fact that the human mind, reflecting on itself, does not perceive itself to be other than a thing that thinks, that its nature or essence consists only in being a thing that thinks, in the sense that this would only exclude all other things which might also be supposed to pertain to the nature of the soul. So when he says, I think, therefore I am, right? I'm only a thinking thing. That's not enough. Just because it seems that I'm only a thinking thing doesn't mean that it's my essence to be a thinking thing, right? To be a thing that thinks, right? And again, this is from the Discourse on Method, which Descartes, assuming that you've already read. And if you haven't read it, then go watch the video, because that's where we talk about the argument for I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, that's in the discourse. And people said that that argument doesn't work, and they gave this objection, right? That, well, just because it seems like I'm a thing that thinks, and maybe that's the only thing I can perceive of myself with certainty or whatever, that doesn't follow that it's my essence to be a thinking thing, right? To this objection, I reply that it was not my intention in that place to exclude these in accordance with the order that looks to the truth of the matter, as to which I was not dealing, but only in accordance with the order of my thought or perception, Thus my meaning was that so far as I was aware, I knew nothing clearly as belonging to my essence, excepting that I was a thing that thinks, or a thing that has in itself the faculty of thinking. So I guess he's saying that even if it doesn't follow necessarily, or it doesn't exclude the possibility that there could be other elements to my essence, insofar as I was aware at that moment, insofar as the only thing I can perceive is my own thinking, it follows that at least the thinking is part of my essence. Right? So even if there might be other stuff that's part of my essence, the fact that thinking is part of my essence does seem to follow from my perception of myself only as a thinking thing. Okay, so he's not excluding things. He's not he's not excluding things in terms of the truth of the matter, right? Because there could be other things that are part of our essence, but only in accordance with the order of my thought, right? I couldn't include anything else into my essence other than thinking at that point, right? Even if there could be other stuff, right? There might be. But when I perceive myself only as a thinking thing, then only thinking is part of my essence. But I shall show hereafter how from the fact that I know no other thing which pertains to my essence, it follows that there is no other thing which really does belong to it. Okay, so that is the step 2, right? So he's saying, in fact, when I do all the reasoning and I give the full argument, in fact, there is nothing else that is really part of the essence of the soul or myself, right? The only essence I really have is to be a thinking thing. And that is not entirely clear from the presentation in the Discourse on Method, and that I didn't mean to exclude it then and there, but in fact, there is nothing else which pertains to my essence other than the fact that I am thinking, right? So he's saying that he's going to respond to that objection in detail in the actual arguments in the Meditations. The second objection is that it does not follow from the fact that I have in myself the idea of something more perfect than I am, that this idea is more perfect than I, and much less that what is represented by the idea exists. Right? So this is his argument for the existence of God, where the argument, if you remember from there, says that if I have the idea of something more perfect than myself, then the idea is more perfect than myself. And if the idea is more perfect than myself, it must represent something that is more perfect from myself, and that more perfect thing must exist also. That's a very condensed version of the argument for the existence of God, or at least one of them. And people didn't like that, right? People said, no, it doesn't follow. But I reply that in this term idea, there is something here equivocal, right? So people are equivocating on the term idea. For it may either be taken materially as any act of my, or as an act of my understanding, and in this sense, it cannot be said that it is more perfect than I. Or it may be taken objectively as the thing which is represented by this act, which, although we do not suppose it to exist outside of my understanding, may nonetheless be more perfect than I because of its essence. So he's making this distinction. This is like a classic philosopher's move, right? Saying, look, you don't like that it doesn't follow that I have this idea and things follow from me having this idea. You say it doesn't follow. You say, we need to make a distinction between two different senses of idea, right? It's either an idea as an act of the understanding, like I have an idea right now, or more objectively, the thing which is represented by the act of the understanding, which is like the it's basically a type token distinction. You can look that up, but like the idea type of God is what's perfect, not any particular instantiation of that idea that I have when I'm just thinking about God, right? So it's not, it's a little more, there's supposed to be objectivity beyond just the mere act of thinking or having an idea, right? So it's not that silly. It's not like, I think of something, really perfect, I think of something that exists, therefore it exists. That's not the way it works. It's the thing which is represented by the act of having the idea. That thing is what's more perfect, right? That thing may nonetheless be more perfect than I am because of its essence. And in following out this treatise, I shall show more fully how, from the sole fact that I have it in myself the idea of a thing more perfect than myself, it follows that this thing truly exists. Okay, so again, like, this is just like responding to an objection that came out of the discourse, and he's saying, look, I can handle this objection too, and I do it in the meditations, right? So he knows what's coming, and he's responding to that objection, or at least he's going to craft his argument in a way that makes this objection not really work, right? In addition to these two objections, I have also seen two fairly lengthy works on the subject, which, however, did not so much impugn my reasonings as my conclusions, and this by arguments drawn from ordinary atheistic sources, right? So there were two other books that came out in between the Discourse on Method and the Meditations, and they didn't impugn the reasonings as my conclusions. And this is interesting. So in any of my critical thinking classes, one of the things that I mention is that when we're evaluating somebody's arguments, we don't want to just look at the conclusions, we want to look at the reasoning, right? So if you see an argument that you don't like and you just deny the conclusion of the argument and ignore the reasoning, that's not the most productive form of disagreement, right? And Descartes is saying that these books that came out were not productive forms of disagreement because they just denied the conclusions rather than engage with the premises of the argument, right? And furthermore, the arguments that they gave in support of the opposite conclusions were ordinary atheistic sources, right? So these were just, everyday atheist arguments. But because such arguments cannot make any impression on the minds of those who really understand my reasonings, and as the judgments of many are so feeble and irrational that they very often allow themselves to be persuaded by the opinions which they have first formed, however false and far removed from reason they may be, rather than by a true and solid but subsequently received refutation of these opinions, I do not desire to reply here to their criticisms in case of being first of all obliged to state them. I shall only say in general that all that is said by the atheist against the existence of God always depends either on the fact that we ascribe to God affections which are human, or that we ascribe to God so much strength and wisdom or that we attribute so much strength and wisdom to our minds that we even have the presumption to desire to determine and understand that which God can and ought to do. Right, so he's saying, I'm not going to argue against all the typical atheist arguments, right? All the edgy atheist arguments like, well, I think right here he's obliquely referring to the problem of evil, right? Like, if God is so good, why does evil exist, right? He's saying, only a feeble, weak mind would that presumes to think you understand what God should or shouldn't be doing and what goodness at the universal level really requires. Are you so arrogant to suggest that you really know what God should be doing? If you build that premise into your argument, then maybe you could say that God should or shouldn't be doing something. But, I dare not be... I dare not attribute that much strength and wisdom to my own mind, right? And so he's sort of dismissing that argument, the edgy atheist argument from evil against the existence of God. And And he's saying, I'm not dealing with that, right? I'm not refuting all the other arguments for the existence or against the existence of God. I'm just giving my argument for the existence of God. In this way, all that they allege will cause us no difficulty, provided only we remember that we must consider our minds as things which are finite and limited, and God as a being who is incomprehensible and infinite. Yeah. Okay, so I guess the idea is that if we remember that God is incomprehensible and infinite, then we won't be so tempted to sort of impose our little, monkey brain value systems onto how God should behave or something like that. Now that I have once and for all recognized and acknowledged the opinions of men, I at once begin to treat of God and the human soul, and at the same time to treat of the whole of the first philosophy, without, however, expecting any praise from the vulgar, and without the hope that my book will have many readers. On the contrary, I should never advise anyone to read it excepting those who desire to meditate seriously with me, and who can detach their minds from affairs of sense, and deliver themselves entirely from every sort of prejudice. So this is Descartes basically begging you to make sure you are in the right frame of mind before you really dive into the meditations. You gotta really be focused and committed and willing to sort of give up your everyday beliefs and think very critically and very clearly and very precisely to take his ideas seriously and meditate with him. That's why it's called the Meditations. I know too well that such men exist in a very small number, right? So, there's not many people who are willing to do what I really hope that they will do when engaging with this work, right? So I know this is a big ask, and most people probably can't be bothered. But for those who, without caring to comprehend the order and connections of my reasonings, form their criticisms on detached portions arbitrarily selected, as is the custom with many, these, I say, will not obtain much profit from reading this treatise. Right? So if you're just gonna, go in and look for little snippets that you can, pick out and say, this is a bad argument, or this is false, right? And just, piece by piece try and tear it apart. You're not worth Descartes' time. You're probably not going to get much out of this. You really got to be in the right mindset and be committed to understanding this stuff carefully and precisely. And although they perhaps in several parts find occasion of cavilling, they can for all their pains make no objection which is urgent or deserving of reply, right? So a lot of people are going to complain about this, but I'm just going to ignore them because they didn't read it the right way. And inasmuch as I make no promise to others to satisfy them at once, and as I do not presume so much on my own powers as to believe myself capable of foreseeing all that can cause difficulty to anyone, I shall first of all set forth in these meditations the very consideration by which I persuade myself that I have reached a certain and evident knowledge of the truth, in order to see if, by the same reason which persuaded me, I can also persuade others. All right, so he's this is just more emphasis on how he's going to bring you in to his mindset and get you to, he's going to present his own standard of certainty and knowledge, and have that be the foundation of the rest of his philosophy, right? He's gonna basically set up what are the epistemic rules that we need to follow. What standard do I need in place to argue for the existence of God and the immortality of the soul? And he's going to set that up first and foremost, right? So pay attention at first, especially, is what he's saying here, more or less. And after that, I shall reply to the objections which have been made to me by persons of genius and learning, to whom I have sent my meditations for examination before submitting them to the press. For they have made so many objections, and these so different, that I venture to promise that it will be difficult for anyone to bring to mind criticisms of any consequence which have not already been touched upon. This is why I beg those who read these meditations to form no judgment upon them unless they have given themselves the trouble to read all the objections as well as the replies I have made to them. Yeah, okay. So, again, he's begging the reader, like, don't be a dummy about this. Read it seriously. Don't, make silly objections. Do your best to understand it as clearly and charitably as you can before you go out and say things like, oh, page 2 has this false thing. Don't do that. Okay. Cool. So that's the preface. So more just begging the reader to take this seriously, and he mentions a couple objections that he's going to deal with in the main text, and these objections again came from people reading his Discourse on Method, where he gives really short versions of the same arguments, and people saying like, oh, this doesn't follow or this doesn't work. He says, nope, I know that you think it doesn't work, but I'm telling you, in this book, this is the book where I show you how it works, and in fact, you're wrong. Right? This objection doesn't work. Okay, so here is the synopsis of the 6 following meditations. Right? And this is basically a précis or a summary of the 6 meditations that he's going to give. And this is the last thing I'll read in this video. It's a couple more pages where he basically just summarizes the meditations. If they don't make a whole lot of sense right now, that's fine. Because you got to wait for the full thing, for the full picture to emerge. But I guess he's just giving a snappy synopsis by way of introduction. In the first meditation, I set forth the reasons for which we may, generally speaking, doubt about all things, and especially about material things, at least so long as we have no other foundations for the sciences than those which we have hitherto possessed. But although the utility of doubt, which is so general not at first appear, which is so general does not at first appear, although the utility of a doubt, which is so general, does not at first appear, it is at the same time very great, inasmuch as it delivers us from every kind of prejudice, and sets out for us a very simple way by which the mind may detach itself from the senses. And finally, it makes it impossible for us to ever doubt those things which we have once observed or once discovered to be true. Right? So the method of doubt is the first meditation, right? Where he talks about doubting everything that can be doubted, at least in accordance with what we think is the foundations for all that we know typically. Right, so there may be somebody else out there, right? Maybe there is some other foundation for the sciences out there that I don't know about, but at least the foundations for all the sciences that I do know about, I'm going to look at that very critically and doubt them, those foundations, and everything that follows from them, consequently. Right? So the method of doubt. That's the first meditation. Second meditation. In the second meditation, mind, which making use of the liberty which pertains to it, takes for granted all those things of whose existence it has the least doubt, are non-existent, recognizes that it is, however, absolutely impossible that it does not itself exist. Let's read that one again, because that's a mouthful. In the second meditation, mind, which making use of the liberty which pertains to it, takes for granted that all those things of whose existence it has the least doubt are non-existent, recognizes that it is, however, absolutely impossible that it does not itself exist. So basically, we're going to doubt everything that we can in accordance with the first meditation. And in the second meditation, we're going to find that even when we doubt absolutely everything, it's going to be absolutely impossible that the mind itself doesn't exist. Right? So we're going to discover that the mind exists. So we'll doubt absolutely everything, and whatever's left is what we believe with certainty, and what we end up believing with certainty when we do that process is that the mind exists. This point is likewise of the greatest moment, inasmuch as by this means a distinction is easily drawn between the things which pertain to the mind, that is to say, the intellectual nature, and those which pertain to the body. All right, so He's going to prove that the mind exists necessarily because we can know it exists with absolute certainty without any room for doubt, and everything else, specifically everything in the material world, is subject to doubt. And the fact that mind is on one side of things and material is on the other side of things, within the sphere of the doubted, that is sort of a preemptive or that anticipates the certainty of the distinction between mind and body, between physical and non-physical substance. So he's basically setting up dualism, right? He's going to argue for the existence of dualism, specifically Cartesian dualism, which is a view in contemporary philosophy of mind that a lot of smart people accept, right? So he's setting that up here. But because it may be that some expect from me in this place a statement of the reasons establishing the immortality of the soul, I feel that I should here make known to them that having aimed at writing nothing in all this treatise of which I do not possess the very exact demonstration, I am obliged to follow a similar order to that made use of by the geometers, which is to begin by putting forward as premises all those things upon which the proposition that we seek depends before coming to any conclusion regarding it, right? So he's saying that, even though I'm talking about the existence of the mind and the difference between the mind and the body in the second meditation, I'm not going to talk about the immortality of the soul just yet, right? So I'm not just saying everything about the soul in one meditation. It's not like meditation 2 is about the soul, and everything that I want to say about the soul is in meditation 2. That's not the case. And you might think that's weird. But the reason for that is that I'm following a method that's kind of like geometrical. And I'll get to that later, but I have to build some other stuff first. Right? And so he's going to explain his process a bit more here. Now, the first and principal matter, which is requisite for thoroughly understanding the immortality of the soul, is to form the clearest possible conception of it, and one which will be entirely distinct from all the conceptions which we may have of the body. And in this meditation, this has been done, right? So we've formed a clear and distinct conception of the mind or the soul in comparison with the body or the physical world. That's all we've done so far in meditation 2. We've set up the dualism and we've decided that the soul or the mind exists. In addition to this, it is requisite that we may be assured that all things which we conceive clearly and distinctly are true in the very way in which we think them. And this could not be proved previously to the fourth meditation, right? So so the fourth meditation is about the true and the false, and basically I need to do work in the fourth meditation before I can prove the existence, or before I can prove the immortality of the soul. Further, we must have a distinct conception of corporeal nature, which is given partly in the second and partly in the fifth and sixth meditations. And finally, we should conclude from all this that those things which we conceive clearly and distinctly as being diverse substances, as we regard mind and body to be, are really substances essentially distinct from one another. And this is the conclusion of the sixth meditation, right? Namely that, the mind and the soul has a certain set of properties, and the body and the physical world has a certain set of properties, and they are distinct. And that distinction gives rise to the conclusion that the soul is immortal, because the soul doesn't decay and change over time and things like that, whereas the body does, the physical world does. So that's like one of the qualities that the physical world has, and the mental world, the soul world, doesn't have. And that's one of the reasons why the soul is immortal. But that comes in the conclusion of the sixth meditation, right? So there's a lot of work to get up to that. This is further confirmed in this same meditation by the fact that we cannot conceive of the body excepting insofar as it is divisible, while the mind cannot be conceived of as excepting as as indivisible. Right, so the physical world is divisible, the mental world, the soul, the mind, it doesn't make sense to divide that into smaller pieces. But it makes sense to divide physical objects into smaller pieces. So divisibility is one thing that is possessed by the physical world, but not possessed by the soul, right? The world of the soul. For we are not able to conceive of the half of a mind as we can do of the smallest of all bodies, right? We can't think about half of a soul. That's kind of weird, right? But we can think of, half of a atom, right? So that we see that not only are their natures different, but even in some respects contrary to one another. I have not, however, dealt further with this matter in this treatise, both because what I have said is sufficient to show clearly that the extinction of the mind does not follow from the corruption of the body, and also to give men the hope of another life after death, as also because the premises from which the immortality of the soul may be deduced depend on an elucidation of a complete system of physics. Okay, so he's actually not going to directly argue for the immortality of the soul. He's just going to argue for the distinction between them, and it follows that just because the body dies doesn't mean that the soul dies as well. So there's room for an immortal soul, but it's not he doesn't argue explicitly for it. It sort of just follows from dualism and from the fact that mind and body and the soul and the physical world are so different from one another that it just doesn't make sense to think of the soul as something that decays or goes out of existence when the body decays. And if I wanted to prove the immortality of the soul directly, I would need to give a complete system of physics, right? This would mean to establish in the first place that all substances generally, that is to say all things which cannot exist without being created by God, are in their nature incorruptible, and that they can never cease to exist unless God, in denying to them his concurrence, reduce them to naught. And secondly, that body, regarded generally, is a substance, which is the reason why it also cannot perish, but that the human body, inasmuch as it differs from other bodies, is composed only of a certain configuration of members and of other similar accidents, while the human mind is not similarly composed of any accidents, but is a pure substance. Okay, so now he's talking about Aristotelian substance here. And the idea is that the mind, being a pure substance, cannot come into or go out of existence, because otherwise you would have creation out of nothing. Creation out of nothing logically doesn't make any sense. So because the mind is a pure substance, it cannot come into or go out of existence, because no pure substance can come into or go out of existence. Our bodies, on the other hand, are just an arrangement or a configuration of substance or accidents, right? I mean, accidents being a configuration of substance, right? So we're just sort of atoms or substance arranged in a certain way. And when we become arranged in a certain way at the end of our lives, the body stops working and we die, right? Our bodies decay. Now that doesn't mean we cease to exist in terms of the substance that we are made of, because the substance stays behind, right? Our bodies are left behind. They're just no longer living, right? So there's no contradiction there, right? The idea is that the soul can persist without the body because the soul is a different sort of substance, right? It's a non-physical substance that persists throughout time and I guess was uncreated and will never decay and will always exist. Whereas our bodies decay because they don't really stop existing. It's just the arrangement of the parts that always exist changes in such a way that's incompatible with life. For although all the accidents of mind can be changed, although, for instance, it thinks certain things, wills others, perceives other things, despite all this, it does not emerge from these changes another mind. The human body, on the other hand, becomes a different thing from the sole fact that the figure or form of any of its portions is found to be changed. So I guess he's saying that all the accidents of the mind, right? So the fact that I think about one thing and I perceive another thing and I desire another thing, right? All those changes don't alter my mind necessarily, right? It's still the same substance. Whereas the changes that affect the body do affect the body in an essential way that changes it into a different thing. I guess, like, I don't know if you like I guess the mind is not as susceptible to change as the body, right? A body can be burned, destroyed, hacked up, drawn and quartered, put into a medieval torture device, blasted off into space, exploded, like whatever, right? You can do all sorts of those things to a body, but you can't really do those things to a mind. The mind sort of persists regardless. At least that's the argument, right? That's the claim. So from this it follows that the human body may indeed easily enough perish, but the mind, or soul of man, I make no real distinction between them, is owing to its nature immortal, right? So here's his like sort of short argument for the immortality of the soul directly, because he thinks it just follows from the necessary differences between the soul or the mind, which, you know, he makes it clear that there's no distinction, and the body or the physical world, right? Those are two completely different things, and one of the qualities of the soul in comparison with the body is that the soul is not subject to the process of decay and radical change that our physical bodies are. That's the idea. You can take that, take it or leave it. I mean, I don't know. It seems like it's possible for, you know, people's minds to decay over time, like when they get very old. But Descartes' not really thinking about that, I guess. Or maybe he would blame that on the decay of the body rather than the soul, I guess. I'm not sure. But anyway, that's the way the argument's supposed to work. Like, from dualism, from the fact that these are two separate things, the mind is immortal and the body is not. In the third meditation, it seems to me that I have explained at sufficient length the principal argument of which I make use in order to prove the existence of God. But nonetheless, because I did not wish in that place to make use of any comparisons derived from corporeal things, so as to withdraw as much as I could the minds of the readers from the senses, there may perhaps have remained many obscurities, which, however, will, I hope, be entirely removed in the replies which I have made to the objections which have been set before me. Okay, so he says, you know, meditation 3, that's where the main argument goes, but I guess because it's a bit abstract and, you know, you're in this mindset of the method of doubt, and all we've established before that is that the soul exists and that there's some differences between the mind and the body, right? There have been some objections, and I hope that my replies have dealt with those, right? Among others, there is, for example, this one: how the idea in us of a being supremely perfect possesses so much objective reality, and thank God he defines it right here, that is to say, participates by representation in so many degrees of being and perfection, that it necessarily proceeds from a cause which is absolutely perfect. So again, we saw this argument in the discourse on method, right? And people don't like this argument, right? People say it doesn't follow. How does it follow? For the idea in us of being supremely perfect possesses so much objective reality, meaning that it participates by representation in so many degrees of being and perfection, that it necessarily proceeds from a cause which is absolutely perfect. Right? So he's saying that if we have an idea that's a representation of something, and that idea is extremely perfect, then the thing that it represents must also be perfect. And that's what he means by objective reality. So we'll talk about objective reality when we get to, I think, Meditation 3. That's where this distinction does the most work. But he defines it earlier on, so we'll get there. This is illustrated in these replies by the comparison of a very perfect machine, the idea of which is found in the mind of some workman. For as the objective contrivance of this idea must have some cause, namely either the science of a workman or that of some other from whom he received the idea, it is similarly impossible that the idea of God which is in us should not have God himself as its cause. So reiterating that he's dealt with this objection in his replies, and he gives this analogy with, I guess having the idea of a perfect machine needs to have some source that is itself a very perfect machine in reality, to give rise to the impression in our mind of a very perfect machine. Take it as you will. We're not talking about the replies here. We're not reading those. Maybe someday we should. Maybe I'll do that one day. But for now, we're just meditations, and he's just like sort of signposting. He's saying, I deal with that later. In the fourth meditation, it is shown that all these things which we very clearly and distinctly perceive are true, and at the same time it is explained in what the nature of error or falsity consists. This must of necessity be known both for the confirmation of the preceding truths and for the better comprehension of those that follow. But it must meanwhile be remarked that I do not in any way treat of sin, that is to say, of the error in which is committed in the pursuit of good and evil, but only of that which arises in the deciding between the true and false. And I do not intend to speak of matters pertaining to the faith or the conduct of life, but only those which concern speculative thoughts and which may be known by the sole aid of the light of nature or reason. Okay, so the fourth meditation, he's talking about truth and falsity, or the nature of error. So he's talking about how we go wrong, right? How falsity and error arises. But he's just clarifying here. He's not talking about sin or moral truth or falseness or moral errors. He's talking just about in the realm of speculation, philosophy, science, thinking, theoretical truth and falsity. In the fifth meditation, corporeal nature generally is explained, and in addition to this, the existence of God is demonstrated by a new proof in which they may possibly be certain difficulties also, but the solution of these will be seen in the replies to the objections. And further I show in what sense it is true to say that the certainty of geometrical demonstrations is itself dependent on the knowledge of God. So we get another argument for the existence of God in the fifth meditation. Finally, in the sixth, I distinguish the action of the understanding from that of the imagination. And those are intellectio and imaginatio. Those are the Latin terms. So understanding versus imagination. And this is important because it's terminology that gets used throughout the rest of the early modern philosophy period and even the later modern philosophy period. This idea of understanding versus imagination. And he didn't invent this distinction, I don't think. He's probably getting it from some sort of medieval scholastic tradition, which he was very familiar with, and a lot of this he presents as original, but it came from earlier sources, and this distinction is one of those things. But regardless, it's very important for later philosophers, right? So I would like to do Spinoza, for example, who was a Cartesian. And if we ever talk about Spinoza and he talks about understanding versus imagination, it's not going to make as much sense unless you've read the sixth meditation. So there you go. The marks by which this distinction is made are described. So how I make this distinction is described. I here show that the mind of man is really distinct from the body, and at the same time that the two are so closely joined together that they form, so to speak, a single thing. All the errors which proceed from these senses are then surveyed, while the means of avoiding them are demonstrated, and finally all the reasons from which we may deduce the existence of material things are set forth. Not that I judge them to be very useful in establishing that which they prove, to wit, that there is in truth a world, or that men possess bodies, and other such things which never have been doubted by anyone of sense, but because in considering these closely we come to see that they are neither so strong nor so evident as those arguments which lead us to the knowledge of our mind and of God. Right. So what he's saying here is that, look, by the time we get to the sixth meditation, I'm going to prove that, the world exists, and that, physical bodies exist, and we have bodies, and that our senses are generally trustworthy, right? He's gonna show all that stuff, and he's saying, well, that's not really useful because only a crazy person would doubt that stuff. But I do want to show that knowledge of the existence of God and the existence of our mind, which is distinct from the body, is more readily known or more easily known, right? So we should be more certain about those things, and those things occur earlier in our proof as we rebuild our edifice of knowledge. So those things are more readily known. So we should be more certain of those things than anything in the physical world, right? So that these last must be the most certain and most evident facts which can fall within the cognizance of the human mind. And this is the whole matter that I have tried to prove in these meditations, for which reason here I omit to speak of many other questions which I dealt incidentally in this discussion. Right? So, again, not going to focus on the immortality of the soul per se, but it follows from what he says about the soul vis-a-vis the body and things like that. Okay, that's the synopsis of the 6 meditations. Okay. And that is all the front matter that I want to get through in this video, which is mercifully short, a mere 90 minutes. Fantastic. And in the next video, we will begin meditation 1 of the things which may be brought into the sphere of the doubtful. Okay, great. That's it. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed the read-through. I hope you're a little bit smarter than you were when you first turned on this video. And I will see you in the next video about meditation 1. So that's it. Have a good one.